Anyone with even a passing interest in naval history can probably tell you, at a glance, what size gun goes on what ship, at least when it comes to the main armament. Destroyers have 5-inch 127mm guns, maybe a bit smaller if they're older or British. Cruisers are either light cruisers with 6-inch 152mm guns, or heavy cruisers with 8-inch 203mm weapons. Battleships and battlecruisers cross the entire range from 12 to 18 inches, 305 to 457mm. Simple, right? Sure, in 90% of cases, but there are some interesting edge cases where it gets a bit more complicated. While I am currently intending to do a longer form video soonish covering the reasons for why certain types of ships use certain caliber guns, this one will be a shorter form video, focused entirely on those few exceptions to the rule. It won't focus much on more standard calibers, and it's going to cut off at the end of World War II for my own sanity, if nothing else. So, moving into that, when do destroyers have guns that fit more on a light cruiser? This one is relatively simple, honestly. Mostly because the only navy to really do this, unless I'm missing something, was the German Navy. Both of them, for that matter. And even then, not very often. Some large destroyers late in the Great War. And one class, with attendant subclass, towards the start of World War II. That was the 1936A destroyers, the Narviks, which were equipped with the same 5.9-inch, 15cm, caliber guns as used on German light cruisers, albeit of a different model. This was done because the German Naval Command thought that the more typical 5-inch guns used on their other destroyers were potentially leaving the ships inferior to those of other navies. This was an interesting viewpoint, I suppose, in that those ships were only really going to be outgunned by the big French destroyers. And going to 5.9-inch guns did little to counter that particular problem, as the main issue with using a light cruiser gun on a destroyer is that suddenly your destroyer is very big and more like a small light cruiser, though this was admittedly a common theme with World War II era German destroyers as a whole. Not to mention in this case that the guns were fairly slow firing in comparison to other destroyers, which would mean that the ships would be outgunned in regards to other destroyers, just plain outshooting them, regardless of the difference in gun size. It should be little surprise only the Germans did this, to my knowledge. Next on the list, we go to cruisers with guns fit for other classes. While there were certainly cases of cruisers using guns fit for smaller ships, notably protected cruisers with 4 to 5-inch guns, and the Atlantas with their 5-inch guns, I'll go over those in more detail in the later video. Here, I will focus on cruisers with guns that seem fit for battleships, not counting battlecruisers here since they're an entirely different category all on their own. You first see this crop up with some of the larger armored cruisers. This is not necessarily surprising when one considers that armored cruisers were often seen as second-line capital ships, or flat-out capital ships in smaller navies. As a direct result, you start seeing them equipped with guns that would have previously been seen on lighter battleships, such as the ever-popular 10-inch gun. This was done both in light of that small capital ship ideal, and in competition with other navies. If the navy you're competing with puts bigger guns on their ships, well, you can't have that, can you? However, while this is pretty common on armored cruisers, including the Japanese saying screw it and going right to 12-inch guns, it pretty much vanishes after that point on, for the most part. The heaviest weapon you typically see on cruisers after battlecruisers come into the picture is 8-inch guns, with notable exceptions in the Deutschlands, which are fundamentally just heavy cruisers with really big guns, and the various supercruiser concepts, which are, funnily enough, a return to the old armored cruiser thing of, well, if my enemy is building ships with big guns, I have to do the same. This is why you see Cruiser Killer used for the Alaska as one example, since she had 12-inch guns entirely to beat down on any hypothetical cruiser she could run into. And finally, for this video, you have the light battleship, where you see battleships using guns that are quite small for their size. This one, however, basically vanishes after the pre-dreadnought era with one notable exception. For the pre-dreadnoughts, though, you see it with second-class battleships. Those are the cheaper ships for foreign stations. Ships like HMS Renown that have 10-inch guns, which, while admittedly heavy for an armored cruiser, are light for a battleship. This was done in some cases for cost reasons. Smaller navies just couldn't afford the bigger guns. And sometimes for rate of fire, as there was a brief period where 10-inch guns fired notably faster than 12-inch guns. The Germans, of course, took this a step further by going as low as 9.4 inches, 24 centimeters, for the holy ideal of hail of fire. Though German ships would almost universally go for smaller caliber, even when they got bigger, since they stuck to 11-inch, 283mm cannon surprisingly long. Again, though, once you hit dreadnoughts, this more or less vanishes. You see dreadnoughts with smaller guns than contemporary ones in foreign navies, perhaps, but, Germany aside, you basically never go below 12 inches, which is as big as cruisers ever got. The one and only exception to this rule comes from, you've probably guessed it at this point, the Germans, who continue the trend of weird calibers with the Scharnhorst class and their 11-inch guns. This is done, once again, because of the rate of fire on the one hand, and because of treaty limitations on the other. It resulted in the ships with the smallest caliber guns for their type in the Second World War, and certainly the swan song of low-caliber battleships. That being said, we'll end this here since this is just a short little video going over some of the exceptions to the rule. Again, there will be a longer form video going over which ships use which caliber and why they use them. Probably also doing a video to cover submarines, which are their own kettle of fish entirely. Looking at you, Surcouf. For now, I hope you enjoyed this little video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. It does help the algorithm.